Have you ever walked into your home and felt that the air itself was holding its breath? That's exactly how I felt the moment I turned the key in the front door that Friday afternoon. Jason had left early for a business trip, his briefcase tucked under his arm, a quick kiss on my cheek, and then the car was gone. The house, usually buzzing with life and the small chaos of daily routines, now seemed unnervingly quiet, almost expectant. I thought I would enjoy the solitude, a chance to breathe and recharge, but instead, a strange tension gnawed at my nerves, leaving me restless. I'm Emily, 34, married to Jason for 8 years. We had what many would call a solid marriage, a comfortable rhythm of routines, dinners, and weekend errands. But recently, the spark seemed buried beneath exhaustion and responsibilities. Jason loved me, I knew that, yet the intimacy we once shared had become predictable, safe, and sometimes painfully distant. And then there was Alex, Jason's son from a previous marriage. At 21, he carried an effortless charm, a mix of his father's crooked smile and an enigmatic intensity one couldn't ignore. Normally, he was just family, a stepson I cared for but didn't think about beyond that. But lately, something about his presence unsettled me in ways I couldn't quite define. Maybe it was his quiet confidence, the way he seemed to notice details others overlooked, or the way his gaze lingered a second too long when we talked. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. A simple chime, but it felt like an alarm in the empty house. I opened the door to see Alex standing there, backpack slung over one shoulder, a casual smile playing on his lips. "Hey, Emily," he said, easy and familiar, as though nothing had changed since our last visit. Yet, everything had changed. Something in the way he looked at me, the subtle shift in his posture, made my pulse quicken. We exchanged the usual greetings, small talk about his classes and friends. But beneath the surface, there was a current, something unspoken, a tension neither of us acknowledged yet that pulsed between us like electricity. I told myself it was harmless, that my mind was simply playing tricks, but the heat creeping up my neck betrayed my reason. By the time we moved to the living room, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor, I realized I was no longer thinking of Alex as just Jason's son. I was thinking of him in a way that made me uncomfortable, aware of every glance, every laugh, every fleeting touch of his hand against mine. And just like that, the house that had felt empty and safe now seemed charged with possibility, danger, and questions I wasn't ready to answer. Something had shifted. Something had begun. And neither of us could ignore it. The house felt different with Alex here, a subtle shift I couldn't quite name. Normally, his presence brought life, laughter, conversation, the kind of youthful energy that makes a home feel lived in. But this time, the energy was charged, taut, like a string pulled too tight. I busied myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, pretending to ignore the way he lingered in the doorway, watching me with that curious, almost assessing gaze. I thought back to when Jason had introduced us. Alex had been 16 then, awkward and quiet, a boy who hid behind headphones and comic books. Over the years, he had grown into a striking young man, tall, lean, with dark hair falling slightly over his forehead and eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. He had his father's smile but carried it with a hint of something untamed, something unpredictable. I had always felt protective of him, the way a stepmother might feel toward a child who isn't biologically hers, but today that instinct wavered under a weight I couldn't name. Jason was gone for the weekend, one of his frequent trips for work. He had called in the morning, his voice warm but distracted, promising to call again that evening. The house, usually a sanctuary, now felt like a stage, the empty spaces amplifying every sound: Alex's laughter, the shuffle of his feet on the hardwood, the rustle of the curtains in the soft afternoon breeze. I kept glancing at him, noticing the subtle angles of his face, the way he leaned casually against the counter, the way his fingers brushed objects as if marking territory I wasn't meant to notice. We fell into conversation naturally, talking about his classes, his friends, the small victories and frustrations of college life. He laughed at my jokes in that easy, effortless way that made the room feel warm, yet underneath, I sensed a tension neither of us wanted to name. Each glance felt loaded, each casual brush of his hand a spark I tried to ignore. I reminded myself constantly he was my stepson, my husband's child, someone off limits. Yet, every instinct in me screamed that this weekend was different, a dangerous edge we were both teetering on. I set the table, noticing the way he watched me, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, as if measuring boundaries I wasn't aware of. I felt a blush creeping up my neck, my heart beat louder than the jazz playing softly from the stereo. Something had shifted. What should have been an ordinary visit felt like the first chapter of a story I wasn't prepared to read, a story charged with unspoken desires and the risk of discovery. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden shadows across the room, I realized that this weekend wouldn't be ordinary. The calm, familiar home I had known for years had transformed into a space where boundaries blurred, and every interaction carried weight I wasn't ready to confront. Something was coming, something I both feared and anticipated. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I understood this was only the beginning. Dinner passed with an uneasy rhythm, laughter that felt forced at times and silences that felt louder than the music. Alex moved around the table with ease, pouring wine for both of us, his hand brushing mine ever so slightly. I flinched inwardly, reminding myself how wrong it would be to feel this way. And yet, there it was, a tension thrumming between us, a magnetic pull I couldn't quite deny. After the plates were cleared, we migrated to the living room. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and curl around us. Alex leaned back on the couch, stretching his legs across the space between us, and I felt my pulse quicken. His gaze met mine more than once, holding just long enough for my thoughts to stumble. I laughed at one of his jokes, but it came out hollow, betraying the nervous excitement buzzing beneath my skin. "You've changed," he said suddenly, voice soft, almost conspiratorial. "I don't know, you seem different." I froze, caught off guard by the statement. "Different? How?" I searched his eyes, trying to decipher whether he meant it in jest, admiration, or something else entirely. "Different how?" I asked, heart hammering despite my attempt at casual curiosity. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I can't put it into words. It's just something." We sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between us. I noticed the way he shifted closer, his knee brushing mine, the subtle scent of his cologne mingling with the warm air of the room. I knew I should pull back, remind myself of boundaries, but a small, reckless part of me wanted to lean in instead. "What are you thinking?" he asked, tilting his head as if reading my thoughts. I bit my lip, unsure how to answer. "Nothing inappropriate," I told myself, but my body didn't agree. My mind raced through memories of our past interactions, moments when he had smiled at me in ways that lingered longer than necessary, touches that felt casual but somehow electric. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, charged with something neither of us could or would name. The tension built, wordless and insistent. Every glance, every casual brush of his hand, was magnified, amplified, a silent language we both understood but pretended not to. I tried to distract myself by mentioning Jason, by talking about mundane college stories, but even that was tainted with awareness of this undercurrent. I caught myself wondering how Jason would feel if he knew how fragile our carefully constructed lives were, and yet, despite every warning, I didn't move away. The firelight reflected in Alex's eyes, making them darker, more intense, and I realized I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, thrilling, and utterly forbidden. By the time we both sank into the couch cushions, exhausted from the weight of unsaid words and stifled desire, I understood one undeniable truth. This weekend had become a test of boundaries, a dance on a knife's edge, and neither of us was ready to step back. Something was about to happen, and I had no idea whether it would bring clarity, chaos, or regret. I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of refilling our wine glasses, trying to steady the racing of my heart. Alex followed, silent, close behind me. The warmth of his presence felt both comforting and dangerous, and I could feel the weight of his gaze on my back, tracing me, noticing me in a way that made my stomach twist. "You're thinking about him," Alex said quietly, voice low, teasing, yet loaded with something more. "He didn't mean Jason, he meant me." My pulse stuttered. I couldn't meet his eyes. I'm not," I stammered, though the lie tasted bitter even as it left my mouth. He tilted his head, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "Emily, it's obvious. You feel it, don't you?" The words struck me like a shock. I wanted to deny it, to retreat to the safety of reason, yet the truth I had been trying to ignore burned hotly inside me. My hands trembled as I gripped the wine bottle, the sound of the cork popping echoing like a small exclamation in the quiet kitchen. Before I could respond, a sound from the front hallway froze me in place, Jason's voice. "Emily, I'm home early." My chest tightened. My husband, my anchor, had returned sooner than expected. Panic surged through me. I spun, and there he stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the scene. Alex a step behind me, and me, flushed, startled, caught in a moment I could barely explain. "Hey, what's going on here?" Jason's voice was calm, but it carried a subtle edge, a caution I couldn't miss. Alex's gaze met mine, searching, perhaps realizing the precariousness of the moment. My throat went dry. We were just talking," I said quickly, trying to sound casual, normal. But my voice cracked. My pulse pounded in my ears. Jason's eyes flicked between us, intuition sharpening in a way that left me exposed. "Talking," he repeated, softer now, but with an undercurrent of unease. Alex stepped back, awareness and guilt coloring his expression. "It's complicated," he said quietly, almost to himself, almost as if he couldn't fully admit it aloud. In that suspended moment, the invisible line we had skirted became painfully clear. The boundaries I had struggled to maintain were no longer theoretical, they were shattered by proximity, temptation, and the undeniable pull of something forbidden. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on the three of us, a silent force that refused to be ignored. I realized then that the weekend had become a turning point, a threshold none of us could step back from easily. Desire, curiosity, fear, and guilt collided in an intense, dizzying storm. And as Jason's steady gaze searched mine, I understood a truth I could no longer deny: everything had changed. Something unspoken lingered in the room, heavy and inevitable. And in that instant, I knew our lives, our family, and even my own heart would never return to the simplicity we once took for granted. The house felt quieter the next morning, but the silence was heavy, weighted with everything that had transpired the night before. Jason had left early for a meeting, his expression calm but unreadable, and Alex had stepped out without a word, leaving behind only a note: "We need to talk later." I read it 3 times, each repetition tightening a knot of anxiety and anticipation in my chest. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee as if it could provide clarity. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind, the glances, the brushes of hands, the tension that had pulsed through the air like electricity. Desire, temptation, and guilt had all collided, leaving me raw and uncertain. I understood now that the danger wasn't just in the act itself but in the emotional currents that had carried me to the edge. Alex's presence lingered, even in his absence, and I could feel the magnetic pull that had threatened to upend everything I had built with Jason. I realized that infidelity isn't always a conscious decision. Sometimes, it creeps in through shared laughter, fleeting touches, and moments of vulnerability. It thrives in silence, in hesitation, in the unspoken acknowledgments we make when no one else is watching. I thought about Jason, about the trust that had bound us together for years. I thought about Alex, and the confusing mix of admiration, desire, and familial loyalty that had entwined our interactions. And I thought about myself, the choices I had almost made, the boundaries I had almost crossed, and the awareness I now carried. By midday, the house felt slightly lighter, though the memory of tension still hung in the corners like a shadow. I took a deep breath, trying to reconcile my feelings with the reality I faced. This weekend had been a test, not of fidelity alone, but of honesty, self-awareness, and the fragility of human emotion. I understood that clarity would not come immediately. Conversations would be had, emotions would be confronted, and the threads of family and desire would need careful untangling. But I also knew that running from the truth would achieve nothing. Confronting it, with courage and honesty, was the only way forward. As I glanced at the empty couch, the memory of the firelight dancing across Alex's features still vivid in my mind, I realized that home is more than walls and furniture. It is the sum of relationships, of trust, of the delicate balance between desire and duty. And though the events of the past hours had shaken that balance, they had also illuminated truths I could no longer ignore. I whispered to myself, Quietly, almost reverently, I cannot undo what has been felt, but I can choose what comes next. The tension, the attraction, the danger, they were now a part of our story, a catalyst for growth, reflection, and understanding. And as the sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the room in gentle golden hues, I felt a fragile but undeniable sense of resolve. The weekend had changed everything, yet in that change, I found a strange clarity. The future was uncertain, but I had the strength to face it honestly, without running, without hiding, and without surrendering to fear.